When we did this in San Diego, we had a similar session about working with police. And we talked about some of the challenges that journalists had working with police and how that's changed and working with law enforcement. And one piece of feedback was we did not really have an avenue, an opportunity for law enforcement officials to talk with us and start a dialogue. So part of the goal of this summit is to start that dialogue here in Philadelphia, but also give you some ideas for things you can do back in your communities if you're not from here to start those conversations, to think differently. And so we've convened a panel of really impressive law enforcement officials from various capacities to sort of share their perspective on the role of law enforcement in dealing with the media, the nature of the relationship today, and ways we can, I won't say work together, but work maybe more effectively so that they can better understand what we do as journalists, and we might have a better sense of how we can communicate more effectively with them. So I'm going to introduce the moderator of this panel, Chuck Wexler. Chuck is the executive director of the Police Executive Research Forum, or PERF, which is a DC-based think tank that serves as a sounding board mostly for police chiefs, high-level police individuals in terms of dealing with complicated issues that might arise in communities. I know Chuck's firm worked with a lot of organizations during the COVID-19 pandemic about police activity then, in the wake of the George Floyd incident and the civil unrest that followed. And before that, he had extensive experience as working in law enforcement in Boston, has a PhD from MIT, degree in criminology from Florida State. He's knighted, yeah. He was knighted for his work in... That's right. So really, and I'm going to turn it over to Chuck to introduce the rest of the panel, but please welcome Chuck and this very impressive group to the stage.
Thank you. I'm going to stay seated if that's okay, because I want to, have a discussion here. So I want to thank you for having us. Actually, a lot of things I do, I'm not crazy about. It's always fun to kind of talk to reporters, because I feel like reporters and cops, believe it or not, have a similar job in terms of getting to the bottom of a story, getting the truth. Sometimes there's conflict, sometimes there's challenges with that relationship, so it's a great opportunity. I do want to thank Kevin Johnson. I want to just a shout out to Kevin Johnson, who, for all the time I was at PERF, and I've been there almost 30 years, Kevin Johnson was a reporter for USA Today, and he was covering the crime beat. And, in terms of when you think about a good reporter, what is a good reporter? It's tell a story, get it right. And so sometimes Kevin had a tough story to tell, and sometimes he had a different kind of story, but he always went to the facts, to the truth. And it didn't matter that we had a good working relationship. Some days, that would be tested, but Kevin Johnson, shout out to you for all you've done over the years. I will tell you one quick funny story, if I can. So this was right after 9/11, and we brought together the SACs from the FBI and police chiefs, and we met and we had this meeting, how do we strengthen a relationship? And we produced a report, and one part of the report said that these task forces are underfunded and they need more resources. So Kevin was writing for USA Today, and he got the hold of the report, and he writes the story up. But the headline in USA Today was, Joint Terrorism Task Forces underfunded. Well, that was part of the story, but as you know, reporters don't generally write the headlines, editors do. So I will tell you this story. I got a call from the head of the FBI, Robert Mueller, who I knew from Boston. He was not happy with that headline. And he had just gotten chewed out by people at the White House. How come these joint terrorism task forces aren't getting the funds they need? And, but, you know, that was Kevin just writing the story, but that's how a story plays out in Washington. That headline, someone's not doing their job. Usually a story is about someone not doing their job. Anyhow, that's it for me. Kevin, appreciate you all these years. My job is to introduce these smart people, and I think we have a great panelists. They all come from a slightly different background, and I think that's what makes this panel so interesting. The way I'd like to do this is like to let them talk and then let you ask questions, so we're having a discussion. We'll get a microphone around to you. So we'll probably go, about a half an hour or so, maybe a little more, and then questions back and forth. I listened to this morning, I was listening this morning a little bit, and I heard one person say, in terms of dealing with PIOs, they said, well, if the PIO doesn't work, you got to torture the chief. You got to torture the chief. Well, I've got a chief here for you to torture, okay? I have brought a police chief here for you to personally torture, and he's used to it too. So this is someone who I've known, pretty much all of my career, and he's not only a great police chief, but he's a great human being. He grew up in Chicago, on the west side of Chicago, in Englewood, which, if you know, is a tough place. You got 2 districts in Chicago. Englewood is one, District 11 is the other. He grew up there. He went into a store one day. He was working in a store, and a couple of cops came in and said, "What do you want to be in 5 years?" He didn't know. He became a cadet in the Chicago Police Department, and in Chicago they pay for your education, so paid for college. Went through college, went all the way up the ranks. Developed the community policing program in Chicago, which would be a national model. Along the way, he became a member of our organization. He got the Gary Hayes Award for aspiring chiefs. And he was supposed to become superintendent in Chicago. How do I know that? Because Mayor Daley back then would tell people to put their name in, but he didn't become superintendent. He got a call. He found out he wasn't getting the job. Worst day of his life, but also the best day, because he got a call from Washington to become police chief of Washington, D.C. At that time, Washington, D.C. was the quote-unquote murder capital of the country. Mayor Barry was the mayor who would be arrested, indicted for cocaine. The city was going into receivership, and long story short, he would reform the Washington, D.C. Police Department. The Washington Post would write a Pulitzer Prize-winning story. I actually worked with those reporters on, the deadliest police department in the country. Now that's, by the way, that's like 20 years before they would win another Pulitzer on police use of force. So he did that in Washington. That department is a different department because of his leadership. He would pick a young lieutenant, Cathy Milhoan, to be one of the aspiring police executives. And that time she did not have a college degree. He encouraged her to go back to college. She would follow him as police chief. He would then go out, work in Iraq for a special commission, and then do some consulting work with us, and then come back here to Philadelphia, would be Philadelphia Police Commissioner. He was appointed by President Obama to be head of the 21st Century Police Commission, and that group would really have a significant role. Today, he's doing everything. You probably see him if there's a major police story on CNN. He's there, and he calls it like he sees it. Some days it's, in support of the police. Some days it's critical. That and an organization he runs, 21CP. He's not the retiring type. That is Chuck Ramsey. I know that bio. Larry Krasner, a really interesting person. He was born in 1961 in St. Louis. His father was a veteran, his mother a minister. He attended public schools in St. Louis and Philadelphia. He would get degrees from the University of Chicago and Stanford Law School. While at Stanford, rather than focusing on corporate law, he worked for indigenous rights, homeless people, and the poor. In 1993, he started his own law practice in Center City, specializing in criminal defense and civil rights. Since then, he has tried thousands of cases in criminal and civil court. He stands up for immigration, disability, and gay rights, as well as the right to free speech. He has defended, normally at no cost, protesters at the RNC 2000, DNC 2016 conventions. During his term, he would shock a lot of people here in Philadelphia from going from a defense attorney to being a prosecutor. That is not usually the career that one chooses. But to his credit, he is a public servant, and he has made his mark on Philadelphia. He has supported victims, he has exonerated the innocent, and he has held police accountable. He has reduced future years of incarceration while helping to drop the jail population. He has focused on the most serious crimes in Philadelphia while working with leaders to address the root causes of violence. He has kept kids out of adult court and kept them home. And he has fought against the powerful, like drug companies and those who steal from workers. He lives in Philadelphia. Wife of third degrees, Larry Krasner. Now here's another interesting one. Cathy Milhoan, she is the assistant director of the FBI's Office of Public Affairs. She has previously worked for the FBI more than 5 years, beginning in 2004. Also when Robert Mueller was the FBI director. She has designed and led the FBI's media training for executives. She left the FBI in 2010 to serve as the Deputy Assistant Director of the Office of Public Affairs at U.S. Immigration and Customs. In 2013, she was named Director of DOD's production at the Defense Department at Fort Meade. Prior to joining the federal government, she was a journalist for several newspapers in Delaware and North Carolina. She's retired from the Air Force Reserve in 2018 after serving in a variety of public and leadership positions. She earned a bachelor's degree in behavioral science and a master's in administration and justice from Wilmington College. Nice to have you here.
Thank you.
So, our objective here is to kind of have a discussion, and I'm going to start with Chuck. You're very good at dealing with the press. I mean, there was a time when you get asked a question, when police chiefs would get asked a question, something very sensitive, whatnot, they'd say, no comment, and that would be accepted. Can you do that today?
Well, it's very difficult. First of all, I'm not a believer in saying no comment. I think that, you can say a lot without saying anything if you really know how to do it, right? And you have to maintain that balance because, reporters have a job that they have to do. Their job is to try to get information. Your job is, in some cases, let's say, to solve a crime or whatever. There's some information you can't provide them, but then there's some information that you can provide, right? Because, that's how the public learns about what's going on. So it's trying to find that balance and being available. And you have to be available in good times and bad. If you want to establish credibility, and all the stories are not going to be positive, but you can't run from them. You got to be there and answer those tough questions and not run and hide. And if something negative is going on in your department, and I've worked in some big departments, and unfortunately we've had some bad stuff happen. But bad news does not improve with age. It just doesn't. Get it out there. Get it out there best you can and deal with it. And so that's the philosophy I've always had in terms of being able to deal with the media. And just one last thing. I never wanted to be in a position where I look like a deer in the headlights. So I had a habit, and I'll use Philly as an example. When I wake up in the morning, I would turn on the news. And I would usually turn to Fox News first. Now, I'm not saying it because Jeff is sitting here or someone else, okay? But I would turn to Fox first, and the reason is because, you had Steve Keeley, you had some pretty good reporters. If something was going on, you had Stratweiser, they would know about it, right? And so if you're not in the A block, that first, and then you can kind of take a sigh of relief, okay? But I would look, and if it's a story about police, I would look to see where the reporter is standing. And if I could see the roundhouse in the backdrop, which was the police headquarters, then I knew they'd be waiting for me. Because I would get in early, right, about 6:30 in the morning. And so that gave me time. I'd call homicide. I could call special victims. I could make a call or two to find out, what do you got? Do we really have a person of interest? What's the deal? Blah, blah, blah. So when the reporters did come to me, not that I would give them anything secret, but I at least would have some knowledge. So it's being prepared. And also to know whether or not this is one that I should call the mayor, so he doesn't look like a deer in the headlights if somebody sticks a mic in his face. You know, and there are some cases that do rise to that level. So it's little things like that. Be prepared, be honest, and tell people as much as you can without compromising an investigation. Because bad guys watch television too. And so you have to be careful.
You had a story here in Philadelphia where for some reason the breathalyzers weren't calibrated correctly.
Right.
And you were asked, Commissioner Ramsey, what happened here? What was your response?
Well, we screwed up. And that's exactly what I said. And if we hadn't been on TV, I'd have used another word. But we did. We screwed up. And so we acknowledged that we screwed up. I actually called the press conference and made the announcement that that's what was going on. And what was so bad, I had a guy from traffic whose job it was to calibrate the machines. He knew for 6 months that this particular machine was not calibrated properly. And when a follow-up question came about, well, what about the people charged with a DUI? Well, listen, one, if it's a serious DUI, you take blood anyway. So you're not going to lose that one because you got blood. But if somebody blew a .09 and slightly, they should be released. They shouldn't have to suffer the consequences. We screwed up. It's on us. And I think you have to just be honest about it because, you know, it is what it is. To try to cover it up, you know, what's the old saying? It's not the crime, it's the cover up. I mean, you look at what's happening now with Secretary Austin. Everybody gets sick and might wind up in a hospital. That ain't nobody upset about that. In fact, he didn't tell anybody for a week. That's the story. And so don't be part of that story. Deal with the real issue.
Okay, let's go to Cathy. Cathy, you have spent a lot of time in federal law enforcement, but before that you were a journalist. Do federal agencies have different standards than state and local in terms of dealing with the press? Is it harder? I mean, I'll be honest with you, you know, it feels like sometimes federal officials can get away with saying no comment, whereas a local police chief might have more trouble. I mean, a local police chief today cannot say no comment and go to a community meeting. What's that like? You've been a journalist. What are the differences?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of, there is a difference, right, between the local and the federal. And a lot of it has to do with the culture. You know, I've had two great careers. One has been a journalist, so I've been in your guys' shoes trying to get those stories. And I had the law enforcement beat, the cops beat, and loved it. And that led me into a career in federal law enforcement because I loved it so much and loved the FBI and wanted to join that. But it's really it's a culture, and it was hard when I first joined the FBI the first time. The FBI is a little bit better at it than other agencies I've been with. That wasn't in my bio, but I spent 5 years as the first non-agent director of communications for the Secret Service. Really hard, and Kevin knows that. Kevin has covered. Kevin and I have been colleagues for years. That was probably even harder than the FBI. Because they put a great emphasis on the secret over the service. You know, great men and women, but they had not engaged with the media at all. They were a solid no comment. The FBI is a little easier in that they really incorporate communications. I know maybe sometimes it doesn't feel like that on the outside, but internally, they know that communications is important. There's not only an office in Washington, D.C., but every field office has a public affairs specialist, at least one, that you all hopefully are engaging with, but a real emphasis on public and community outreach. But it does get hard, right? I think one of the hardest things sometimes is the partnership where we're trying, and Chuck, you've experienced this with us, right? Where there's an incident somewhere, Chuck's department is the lead, but somebody sees the FBI or they see some other federal law enforcement agency, and so they say, oh, the FBI, the FBI is there, they're investigating. And it's a balance of trying to be respectful to the local department who has the lead on that investigation. We've got a great working relationship behind the scene. And so we're trying to get the media to it's their investigation, it's not ours. And so that creates a conflict sometimes, right? Where the media wants to say, the FBI, tell us what's going on. We saw you, we know you're there. But behind the scenes, the relationships, we have to wait for the police department to ask us for help. We just can't walk in and take, it's not like the movies, right, where we just walk in. And this happens every single day. I'm not picking on Fox, but during the Idaho murders, Fox called us every single day without fail and said, when are the Idaho Police Department is screwing this up. When is the FBI going to go in and say, get out of the way, Idaho, we're going to take over the investigation? Every day without fail. And we knew behind the scenes, the Idaho Police Department was doing a great job. They might not always communicate it very well, but from an investigative standpoint, they knew what they were doing. So the culture is definitely, it's hard. The relationships, trying to be respectful. I think that's where it comes across, right, as we're not being forthcoming. But it's trying to respect the relationship and the investigation that's being conducted by the local agency and not stepping on what they're doing.
Suppose these are reporters. So suppose reporter wants to talk to an FBI agent about an ongoing investigation. Those FBI agents are going to be reluctant to talk. How could they navigate that and be able to get to that story? Is that even possible with an ongoing investigation? How should they approach that?
Sure. So it is possible. I've been listening to you all morning, so I've heard all the talk about the PIO and the dislike sometimes for that role and what they do. Let me tell you a little about the PAO role, though. We call it a public affairs officer, or a PIO. In the federal government, especially the FBI, a decade ago, they were all agents. And typically they were the lawyer. They were the chief division counsel in the office. And under a guy named John Miller, who you guys probably see on TV, who's a former journalist as well, and under Director Mueller, we made a real proactive just change in culture. And we started bringing in what we call professional staff, and we hired former journalists like you all to come in. We said, this is ridiculous. Agents are not trained to talk to the media. They don't know how to do it. They were never trained to do it. It is now. It wasn't then. And so we started bringing in former journalists to do that. So know that when you're talking to those folks, the majority of them, probably 97%, have all been in your shoes. The second thing is most federal agencies, especially law enforcement, there's a policy that prohibits agents from speaking from any employee. It has to be authorized to speak with the media. And so that's written in policy. I get a lot of folks like reach out to agents via LinkedIn. You guys just see them on there and you hit them up. They have to report that every time. So the more you push, the more they retreat, right? They're saying, okay, media, I'm having a media contact. By policy, I have to report this. Come through the PIO. I know it sounds like a pain, but that's the best way to get the story. We too are trying to help you get that story out, and we want to tell it. When it comes to the actual investigator, it gets a little tricky, right? And take your reporter hat off for just a second and just put your average citizen hat on, right? You're being investigated for a crime that you may or may not have committed. Do you want the agency and the investigator to sit down with a news outlet and talk about your case? No, right? The Constitution protects your rights on a whole host of things. And so in all likelihood, no, we're not going to have the investigator. We'll try to get somebody to talk about that type of crime. But we're not going to do anything to jeopardize, one, the case, or two, violate the alleged, their civil rights by being out there talking about it. But we will do our best to get you somebody who can talk about that sort of crime. And that's often when we turn to formers like Chuck, and that's why you see him and others right on television a lot, talking about the things that we can't get you one of the investigators to talk about.
Larry, you're the district attorney of Philadelphia. You're a prosecutor. Your job is to get to the bottom of the truth, hold people accountable. When reporters call the district attorney's office, I'm sure it's a balancing act between wanting to give them information and also wanting to protect an ongoing investigation. How do you balance those competing interests?
I actually think that part is really easy. I agree with Chuck Ramsey that you say as much as you can. You try not to stand behind something that is as much of a stiff arm as no comment. You say as much as you can, or you explain why it is you can't say more at this time, and then you offer at a time when you can without harming the integrity of an investigation or whatever the other reason is, whether it's a privacy issue around juveniles or protecting identities of victims. You explain why you can't talk about it now, and if there's the possibility of talking about it later, you say that you can do that. For me, a lot of what I have seen in dealing with journalism is filtered by my own life experience, which includes the fact that my father was a writer. He was a writer, he was an author, he was a journalist at times. He did a little bit of local television at one point, and he made his living doing that essentially, starting when he was in the military, having volunteered to serve in World War II. He was writing in the military on the GI Bill. He got a degree in creative writing from Columbia University, and he went from there. So I grew up in a house where not only was he a news junkie, and we're watching Walter Cronkite every night when I'm 7, but I grew up in a house, watching a struggling writer, because that is what he was. Do this kind of work for a long time. And I have to tell you, based on my childhood, never having expected to run for public office and then ending up at 56 in this odd position, I had a very, very elevated view of journalism. I still, in many ways, have an elevated view of journalism. But from my perspective, I could enumerate for you about 15 things that I think are horrible that prosecutors have been doing for a very, very long time. I do think it is important that we are all direct and honest and open with each other about things that have not gone well in the past. I sense that's the purpose of this gathering. I see what you have here, beyond if it bleeds, it leads. But I think the way you get beyond if it bleeds, it leads is by recognizing facts such as the following. There is a clear pattern over more than 30 years that while crime was declining, every time that they polled the public, they found that on average 65% of the US population was sure every year that crime was going up. Well, come on, how did that happen? It was not just journalism, it was entertainment, it was politics. One of our crimiest presidents, Richard Nixon, hollering about lawlessness, standing next to our crimiest vice president, Spiro Agnew. That is where this all comes from. And hopefully the path forward is one where, in my opinion, the topics that are covered, the stories that are covered are broader, and I will give you a list if you want to hear them, are more imaginative, they are more contextualized. I understand that a lot of journalists are dealing with the economic realities, the editorial realities of what's going on. But I have seen in Philadelphia, in my opinion, improvement in the quality of coverage over the last few years during a very difficult time. I've seen more of an interest in providing not just a sensational story, but the context as to whether it reflects a broader pattern. In my opinion, there are so many sort of really fascinating stories that could be covered out there that I shouldn't have to just sort of pluck articles from less available publications and then put it up on our social media. There's really wonderful topics to cover that are not covered in American tradition, and I think they can be. And in the same way that I'm being very candid with you, I think most prosecutors in the United States in history have been a disaster. I do think that there's some room for improvement in terms of what's done with journalism. And if a lot of it, frankly, is prosecutors' fault. They have not made data available. They have been deliberately black boxes because they felt controlling the information is how you get reelected. We've done something else and been clobbered at times for it and done well. at times for it. So I am in no way saying this is your fault. I'm not saying that. What I am saying is, as someone who really reveres writing, really reveres journalism, I just think that there is more that journalism can do than what bleeds leads and having a symbiotic relationship with centrist politicians, which is absolutely what has gone on in this country for a long time. The same entity that's covering what a prosecutor, for example, or a mayor is doing is an entity that's going to recommend or is going to endorse a particular prosecutor or mayor who's coming up for election or re-election. I just think there are ways that we can all do better. And then maybe we wouldn't be the most incarcerated country in the world and also one of the most unsafe. Maybe we wouldn't be a country that basically leads the world in terms of having the highest cause of death for juveniles be guns, which is what it actually is.
When you read a story and there are inaccuracies in it, and maybe you did an interview with someone, is there a way that you have found to, in quotes here, educate that reporter? I mean, do you ever feel the need to give feedback or go off the record and put something in context? When you just read something, you go, damn, that's not what I said, or that's not the facts, or in your position, are you just, that's not your role?
Well, fortunately, I have a chief of communications, Jane Rowe, who's sitting right there in the back. I believe that Jane does have some of those conversations, that she will call at times and say, you know, what you have put in this article is a misquote or it's factually incorrect and you should correct it. And sometimes, you know, journalists and their editors listen and change it. A lot of what is out there now is digital, and sometimes they don't. I mean, in general, I've actually found that the reporting of what I said was quite accurate. And in general, I've found that when there are facts as opposed to wild opinions, I found it's pretty accurate. But I can think back on something that made me a little angry, which is a 4-part answer I gave. The first 3 parts were essentially, these kind of crimes are not going up. The 4th part was, but gun violence is through the roof. And that quote showed up with capitalization at the beginning and a period at the end of part 3, and completely omitted part 4, which drew national criticism, local criticism, and ex-mayor's criticism. You know, that's galling. That's not cool. When you're using a period and you're choosing to leave out the 4th clause in a 4-part answer and turn it into a deceptive version of what I did, that's bothersome. But I can tell you, in 6 years, I've seen very little of that. I really have. And I recognize that I make mistakes every day, and I'm sure I'm not the only one.
So now I'm going to start back to Chuck. Has journalism changed in any fundamental way since the murder of George Floyd? Have reporters, in your view, are they looking at things differently? And of course, this is a question for the audience when we have discussion. I can tell you from my perspective, from a policing perspective, it feels like reporters are looking at things differently. What's have you noticed this at all? Are we in a different period? Because it feels like the relationship between the police and journalists is a little frayed. Individual over here, was talking about, the role of the PIO, and PIO is like a sort of the company spokesman versus, getting at the facts. It feels like the credibility of policing has been shook, and media role feels like they have to double down. That may or may not be correct. But what do you think, Chuck?
Well, I'm retired now, so I don't have the same kind of interactions that I did when I was actually active as a police chief. But, listen, there are times when the criticism is 100% legit. And that's an instance where it's 100% legit. I mean, that never should have happened. And when you see these viral videos of Memphis and George Floyd and all these others, I mean, that's a black eye on policing, period. And the only thing you can say is honestly say it's wrong, and that person ought to be arrested, ought to be prosecuted for what they did, and not try to put a spin on it as if, you know, the actions of the police officer was anything other than what it really was. I mean, people aren't stupid. That's what they're looking at. And so, in a way, I think it's healthy. I think it's good. I think the way real change happens is usually when you have something controversial, when it's forced. And I think that, you know, keeping everybody honest is part of your responsibility as journalists. And, you know, when people say, well, how do you improve relationships? It's not about that. There should be a healthy distance between reporters and police in this case, or prosecutors or whatever. I don't have a problem with that. I agree with the district attorney as long as the information you're printing or that you're reporting on is accurate, right, and not spun in a particular way. Then I don't have a problem with it. But I think if you really want change, I think change really starts when you have an incident like George Floyd. As painful as it was to watch that, that's really what sparks legitimate change. And so I don't see it as a total negative. Is it embarrassing? Yeah. Is it something that reflects on the entire profession? No, it doesn't. But it's partly our fault as leaders. We have allowed the few to define the many by putting up with some of the crap that a few cops do in an agency and not really taking the action that you need to take before it gets to a George Floyd point or before it gets to something in Memphis. When you look at Memphis and the way those officers acted, don't tell me that's the first time they've ever done that. It's not. Don't tell me some sergeant or somebody else doesn't know that there was a rogue group of cops out there doing whatever they knew, but they didn't do anything about it, you see. And so that's a failure of leadership at all levels. When you let things get to that point and then cry about it when it gets reported on or is shown over and over again, we can fix this. And it's, you know, it's just a few bad apples. Okay, if you're walking through an orchard and you see a bunch of bad apples laying on the ground, you better check the tree. There's something wrong with the tree, okay? It's systemic. It's not just a few bad apples, okay? And so you got to deal with the problem, the root problem, and correct it. Then you don't have to deal with all this other nonsense.
Let me address an issue that I heard this morning, which is, you know, the role of the PAO versus the role of the chief. It seems to me, watching you for a long time in both Washington and Philadelphia, you did most of the talking. I mean, on big issues, you didn't put a PAO out there, and I could be really wrong.
No, on big issues, but it depends, and it's a gut feeling. There are some times when people need to see the chief, and you need to be the person standing up and making a comment. There are other times when it's appropriate for it to be the public information officer. It depends, you know. But I don't think that in times, especially if the news is bad. Now, if it's something positive, that's when I would like to see other people in front of the camera, because I wanted people to associate them with positive things, not just negative things, okay? And so if it was something negative, that's when I felt it was my responsibility as head of the agency to be the primary spokesperson.
Would you give your cell phone number to reporters?
Yeah, I
Which
did.
reporters would you give them to?
Anyone that asked for it, I gave them my cell phone number. Now, when I retired, I changed my number. But if they wanted my number, they had. Listen, there are a lot of reporters that know me in this room right now. I didn't run from stuff. I didn't run from stuff. I went for periods of time. It's hard to read negative things in the press. I went for periods of time I didn't read the paper because I knew it would just upset me and I would lose my focus on what I needed to do. This stuff about tough skin, everyone, believe me, is sensitive to, you know, attacks if they're personal, you know, on you or your agency. And so, you know, you go through those periods of time. But if it's negative, it's negative. Sometimes we deserve to get our butts kicked. There are other times when maybe it wasn't. But I think if it's negative, I think that's when the chief needs to step up and actually answer those questions that are being asked, because that's your job as head of an agency.
Cathy, what goes into a productive relationship? And the other side of that is, when does it break down? What can reporters learn from how to cover federal agencies? How can they do their job, tell their story, You know, and can you give us an example where when they made a mistake that, you know, actually wasn't good for them, wasn't good for you?
Yeah, look, I think it all boils down to relationships. You having them with us and vice versa. Going back to that culture, right, that developed a program at the FBI where we teach people how to engage with the media and how to have these conversations. Kevin and I are, you know, I've changed agencies, but him and I have known each other for years. We go out, we have coffee. I remember when I was with the Secret Service, right? So I have a deputy is an agent, and a reporter calls and says, "Hey, can we just have coffee?" And he came in and said, "Oh my God, they want to have coffee." I'm like, "This is great. They want to have coffee. This is what you want to do. This is engagement." And he's like, I can go have coffee?" I'm like, "Yeah, you're the deputy for the public affairs office. Yes, I want you to go have coffee with like the Kevin Johnsons of the world, right? He's just a man. He puts his pants on." And I mean, and this is an agent who, like, his background, I mean, this is like a badass, like, you know, Secret Service guy who's been like, you know, just crazy, a wonderful background, right? If you're going to go into a bad situation, I'd want him with me. He was terrified to go have coffee with the reporter. And he said, you want to come with me? I'm like, I can go with you if you want, but this is just a conversation, right? We're just, and that's it, right? Law enforcement needs to recognize that you all are just, you know, everyday people doing the job. You have pressures, you know, in the newsroom and personal, you know, personal things as well. Kevin and I have you know, our parents are, you know, aging of the same age. Kevin and I have talked about work, and we've shared what it's like to be, you know, of our age and have our parents, you know, getting older and helping to take care of them. But you got to have those conversations. It's got to be a relationship. Don't come into it. Something I see sometimes is, right, and I saw this in the newsroom, and it best job I loved being a reporter. I would not change the years of that and leading a newsroom. I got a little discouraged though, right, as people would join the newsroom and they would want to go talk to the police, or they had that beat, and they came into it with, there's got to be something bad. There's a scandal here. There's got to be something bad. There's got to be corruption, and I'm going to find out. And my husband was in law enforcement at the time, and convincing the reporters, well, like, go into this, just don't go into it like they're bad, right? I sleep with the man every night. I promise they're not bad, right? Like, they're not all bad. I know one of them's not, right? He's just, again, just an everyday person, you know, who's just trying to do a job and serve his community just like you all are doing too. And so come into it with that attitude, not with the barrier kind of up, like, you know, they're bad, they don't talk to me, they must be trying to cover up something. And then we encourage our folks too to come out with, you know, you all have a job to do, and it's a hard one. You know, you mentioned, Chuck, just that change, you know, that your all's job has gotten harder. You know, our job has gotten harder, and yours has too. And so it's just that recognition, you know, on both sides. That you're trying to tell a story, we're trying to get out information, and so how can we best come together? But it all comes down to relationships. Get on that phone, talk to people. Kevin and I and the other justice correspondents, you know, I'm the head of this. I talk to those guys every single day. We check in, what's going on? What are you working on? Here's some things the FBI is doing around the country. And when it comes to the bad things, yeah, I've had those conversations. My rule is I'm going to start with you first, right? I have seen fist fights, never forget this, in the newsroom. A reporter knocked out cold a copy editor. And we're like, okay, that's not happened before, but broke his hand, knocked him out cold because he'd you know, written a story, had an agreement that the story was kind of, you know, the reporter understood how the story was going to be, and the copy editor made some crazy headline. And it cut out, you know, like a 1,200-word story became a 700-word story. The 400 words that got cut out, yeah, that was a lot of context, and that mattered. So my rule of thumb, and what we try, you know, we start with the reporter first and say, hey, let's talk about that. I recognize that you all don't have a lot of control over that, right? Or you're hoping to get on air for 1:30, and they're like, you got 45 seconds.
Okay. Let me ask Larry one question, then we're going to go to you, so start thinking about it. I know we're up against time. Is the very nature of this relationship adversarial? I mean, is adversarial just what their job is? Have you figured out a way to make it less adversarial?
Come on, man.
Jeff, thank you for that outburst. And I say that with love. Well, I do think there's a way to make it less adversarial. And I think, I'll answer the rest of your question in a minute, but I think the way to make it less adversarial is to be available frequently. You know, one of the things that happened in our office is that in addition to sort of responding to the news du jour or responding to the incoming mortar fire, we started having a regular Monday press conference in the middle of a horrific gun violence crisis where the primary topic was gun violence that happened in the last week, and then the secondary topic would be something else. It is my belief that our relationship with the media has gotten better for a number of reasons, but I think that is just one of the reasons. It's when everything is not response or maybe a proactive effort to get out the DA's message to combat some other narrative. When there's just sort of like a regular check-in, when we're all going to see each other on Monday and we're going to talk about big stories, little stories, or we're just going to, you know, provide more detail and context for what is, at the moment, the most compelling issue, which is gun violence within criminal justice. I think that that's positive. And I actually think there's another thing that would be very positive, and that would be if on a regular basis there was an off-the-record sit-down, not just with journalists, but with their editors and with their producers.
They would love that. You
Hey,
signing up? You guys would love that, right?
I'm 100% signing up. I'll tell you why. Because I would love to sit in that room and say, have you ever thought about covering the reality that in Germany they have 11% of our level of incarceration, and they have 11% of our level of homicide. And they also have no death penalty, and everybody gets considered for parole at 15 years. I mean, can you find a more violent, racist society? But that's what they got going on. Have you ever thought of covering this? Well, no, because we never cover anything international. Okay. Have you thought of covering the fact that in Portugal they have the most successful drug treatment program in the history of the world, where they've reduced on-street heroin use 80% over 20 years, invented by a doctor, doesn't involve criminal courts? Have you thought about doing that? You know, have you thought about the Third Ways article a couple years ago that said the murder rate is 40% higher in Trump states? 40. And yet somehow centrist Democrats cower when Republicans say they're good at handling crime. I mean, to me, these are sort of like really fun, interesting stories that we could all get into. Obviously, much smaller topics, much more local topics as well. But I think if those kinds of conversations occurred, one of my 10 ideas might be interesting enough that somebody would want to do it. And I would be hearing, 10 ideas coming from journalists and their editors and their producers, and I would be in a position to say, well, you know what, I got a 15-person data team headed by a criminologist. Let me look at that data, and let me give you that data, and let's see what it looks like. Not every DA is going to do that, because most of them prefer to be in a black box, release no data, and claim every victory as if they did it themselves and blame everybody else when things are going poorly. That's kind of like how politics works. But I think that would be great. If I had a once every 3 months, once every 6 months sit down with all the major news outlets that was off the record, I think we could have some really significant improvement in the breadth and the contextualization of a lot of coverage.
Okay, great. So let me just do this. Let me open it up to you, kind of, yes, ma'am, just say, if you wouldn't mind saying your name, what paper you're from, and then whatever you want to ask.
Hi.
Yeah, we need the microphone. Yeah, thanks.
I don't know if I need. Leah Uko, NBC 10, Philadelphia. Question, Krasner. Anytime we get a chance to talk with you, I'm grateful for that. You have some great ideas, story ideas specifically, but also just how to get beyond if it bleeds, it leads. I've been here for almost 2 years, so I'm still looking at your role very objectively as somebody in the newsroom. You know how a lot of people feel about you in the newsroom. There's a lot of criticism, but I'm looking from the outside, even though I'm in the inside now. And from what I see when I deal with you, I do appreciate the availability. It does make the job a lot easier. It does make you, in my opinion, on that note, I'm not here to talk about all the things people nitpick, but it does make me appreciate working with you being available. Do you think that what you're saying here today, though, could have influence if you were to suggest that to decision makers in the newsroom? I'm very big on getting rid of middlemen, and technically reporters, producers, we're middlemen. Do you think that what you just said would resonate with a general manager, a news director, a VP of news, because they are the people who have to answer to the above people who like bleeds, it leads, because technically news, public service, sure, but it also is sells. Crime sells. It's what drives ratings. That's a big reason why we cover crime. It's things that people aren't going to admit, but it is what it is. So what you're saying, do you think that if you were to suggest that to people who are closer to the people who make the decisions that trickle down to all of our jobs, do you think it would resonate? Or do you think, are you saying, nope, the power's on us, take this back, take these notes back to the newsroom, relay?
No, I mean, ideally, I think these kinds of off-the-record conversations would happen with all the decision makers available and in the room. I think the smart decision makers recognize the reality of how difficult it has become economically for a lot of what we would consider to be established or traditional journalism. I would think the smart ones would be looking for a foothold and would be open to ideas. They would realize that they still can claim the mantle of integrity while social media has frankly become a cesspool of untruth. I think that they would be interested, but I mean, you would know better than me. Some of them are driven exclusively by profit, so I imagine. Some of them, I imagine, are driven exclusively by long-standing relationships that are one-sided and are not fully reflective of what's going on. I mean, look, let's be honest about it. I got the same problems with Bob Brady. Bob Brady of the Democratic Party, even when I was an incumbent during an election that I won by 44 points, didn't endorse me for the first time in 40 years. When you are actually doing something that's a little different, the institutions are not going to love it. That is the nature of social justice movements, and we are a part of that. That's just how it's going to be. But I see absolutely no downside if those people are willing to get into the room to having that discussion. The worst thing that happens is they say, that's stupid. Let's just cover a sensational story and not contextualize it at all. Okay, that's where we are now too often. So I'm all in. Go back, let them know. I'll see you once every 3 months.
So last Jake set that up.
Oh, this,
Okay, let's
if
get
you want
a,
to go now, we'll go now.
Can I address that for just one quick second? So we had a lot of success last year from a federal level at the FBI doing exactly that. The reporter would, the news, the broadcast reporter would report some story. We'd see something online, and we'd talk to the reporter and say, like, what do you mean? Like, did you see the story? They had not, right? So the TV journalist was getting it right. The justice correspondent was getting it right. So we started an FBI 101, where we did exactly what you said. And we went up to New York, and we sat down with Fox, and we sat down with CBS and NBC and ABC. And they brought in not only executives, but the digital team. Because the people who, you cover certain departments, right? You cover cops and crime, so you understand it. But many of you, I'm sure, have been sitting there with your editor trying to explain, like, hey, either this isn't a story, or you're trying to give, like, the perspective, and they just don't understand it. And it's like, no, you got to go on air, you got to go tell this story. They see it a different way. So we had a lot of success last year doing that with all the networks, and it was great. It was all off the record, but it's the same thing, and they better understand why we do things and why we don't. And it's really improved not only the relationship with the reporter covering us, but the digital team as well.
okay. Let's take another question.
You're welcome.
And then say who you are, where you're reporting
I don't know if this
from.
thing, is it? Okay.
It is.
Yep.
As a news director, my name's Casey Clark. I'm the news director for a station down in Charlotte. The relationship between the police department and the local news media had gotten so bad that the general managers and the police chief decided we would have a little off-the-record summit. General managers, news directors, and supposedly the chief executive team of the police department were going to be there. The police chief showed up 20 minutes late, walked in, shook everybody's hand, and said, I really love that you're all here. I'm sure you can all figure this out.
Wow.
And he left. And that is not a one-off. This is the 15th television station I've worked for. The arrogance of a lot of law enforcement leaders is really bad. And you're agreeing with me.
I am.
So,
And let's also be honest. I mean, Mr. Ramsey, I know that now you're on CNN and a lot of people have a lot of respect for it. In 2002, You rounded up journalists. You
There
rounded,
was a few. Now let's put it in context.
but you rounded up protesters and journalists, and you threw them in jail, and you lost a federal lawsuit.
There were some that were mixed in there. And I also, with the Washington Post, did a op-ed apologizing to everyone because we screwed that up. And I wrote an op-ed. Did you know that?
I did know that.
Then you should have said that as well. And so the point is this. I'm not perfect. I'm far from it, okay?
I understand.
But I've never been accused. I'm not arrogant, and I'll sit down and talk to anybody. But that doesn't mean that we don't screw up. Now, did I personally make those arrests? No.
No, but
But
your
I'm
own officers,
responsible for the
your
people
own-
that did.
Sir,
But I
your own
owned up to it.
officers said that you gave the order.
But that's
they
bullshit.
said it under
It
oath.
was bullshit. And the guy who said it, I suspended 2 months before. But I wrote an op-ed apologizing for that arrest. It was wrong. It was wrong. But here's the issue. Here's another issue. Because we need to figure out when there is access to crime scenes, reporters that don't move when they're asked to move during a protest. Should police even ask them to move? I mean, that's the kind of topic, if you have that kind of off-the-record discussion, you can iron those kinds of things out. Those protests get pretty damn violent, and that was one of them, and it came 2002, 1 year after 9/11, and the incident occurred 1 block from the White House. And don't think we weren't concerned about terrorism and everything else. Did
You
we
never gave a
overreact?
disbursement order, though.
Wait a minute. Bullshit, we did. But, and I'm going by my guy who was there, but we still shouldn't have made the arrest because it wasn't clear to everybody in there that we made the disbursement. So, I mean, I don't know what else you want me to do, but I did write an op-ed and I did apologize. How many chiefs do you know, after they fuck up, write an op-ed and have it published in a major paper? Tell me that.
That is unique.
But
I will give you
How
that.
many?
That is unique.
You damn right you give me that because I did it. Because I did it.
I mean,
no, man, come on now.
To be honest, the way you framed that question,
It's exactly what we're talking about
I
here.
mean, the way you didn't say, 20 years ago you did this, and that you've since gone, back to court afterwards, and you've since said, don't make mass arrests, which he has said. But forgive me, the way you framed that felt a little accusatory.
It was accusatory. It was 22 years ago, and you
mean,
left out a very important
I said 2002.
of the
said
story.
2002.
But you left out a very important part of the story.
I mean, it feels like if people didn't know that context, that he ordered the arrest. I know what you're talking about, Persian Park.
Yes.
It's a bunch of people. There were reporters in there. An order was given. They arrested him. He apologized. And he said, what is the lesson? Because I asked him this in those situations. Do not make mass arrests. Did they make a mistake? Yes. Did he acknowledge it? But forgive me, the tone of your question was like, why did you do this? When here he's coming here to share, it didn't feel right.
Were you
Sorry.
in Pershing Park?
No, sir, I was not.
All right, well-
I was working here in Philadelphia.
All right, yeah, right. But you weren't there, so you don't know everything that went on, okay? So all I'm saying is this. We screwed up. I said it publicly. I wrote an op-ed that was published in the Washington Post apologizing not only to the media, but to every single person, including some folks that were out there doing wrong, that we should not have made the arrest the way we made it. Now, you name me another one that's actually gone that far to write an open apology, which I was not asked to do, because we screwed up. We screwed up. My suggestion to you, you need to try to get over it, man. It's been 20 years.
And
God
just
damn.
to say, that was 20 years ago. He comes to Philadelphia, and he has his people during the Occupy movement read the First Amendment
Every roll
morning.
call. Every roll call, we read the First Amendment of the Constitution. Why? Because people have a right to protest. They have a right to be there. They are not your enemy. And guess what? That Constitution is also your Constitution. So don't be so quick to take away rights.
So-
Now, that's a lesson learned.
Okay.
That's
So-
a lesson learned.
So that's good context. So is that something that you can say from what happened in D.C., you took that with you,
Yeah.
and you came to Philadelphia and you learned from it?
I learned from it. There's no
Great.
question about it.
Great.
But ask the,
Unfortunately, so many have not.
well,
Correct.
but I'm not responsible
Correct.
for those others, but I am responsible for myself. And you started your question about with me personally. And you got reporters in the room from Philly. You may have some from Washington that have worked with me. You know, I mean, listen, I'm not perfect. I am probably the furthest from, well, no,
And
Chuck
me too.
Wexler might be less perfect than me. But other than Chuck, okay, I'm certainly not perfect. But I'll be damned if I take too much heat for something that I did, I acknowledged, and then I also apologized for it. At some point in time, I mean,
look,
come on.
First of all, I'm actually glad you brought it up because I think there's a teaching moment here in how you ask a question and then the response you get. And, you know, I don't know what happened in Charlotte. I don't know why that happened. But those are two different situations, and to tie them together. But let's take another question.
Get Jeff. He's over there about to die.
I've got two really quickly for Cathy. Cathy, does the FBI punish agents who speak off the record to reporters if you know they have? And if you do, what are the punishments?
No, if we know they're going to speak with you, no, there's no punishment.
No. If they speak off the record to reporters, FBI agents working a case, if they do, which you say you prohibit, I think, and you find out they do you punish them, and what would you do?
They have to report media contact, whether it's off the record or not. So if they've had a conversation, right, they should be reporting that per the policy.
So if an FBI agent offers direction in some way to a reporter working a story, you find that out without them approving that, you will punish them.
Punish is a little hard, but it's against policy. So yeah, I mean, there's actions that the special agent in charge can take, and that can be from, like, you know, talk to them, like, you got to report that.
Does the FBI see any importance in agents working cases to offer direction, to offer
Yes,
we
do that
to
every
soil
yeah.
it?
We do that every day.
I'm talking about agents who are actually on the ground working the case. Do you see that as something that could happen?
Yeah, it happens, and it has the potential to be a problem. It has been a problem. But usually that can be accomplished by the agent just saying, hey, I want to, like, we need to speak with the reporter about this. I'm getting questions like this happens every day, right? Where the reporting is going one way. We want to make sure that people have the context, and we have that conversation.
Okay, real quickly for Mr. Krasner, do you believe that your press coverage has been unusually aggressive or unfair because you see yourself and has acted as what the country terms a progressive prosecutor? You've spoken about issues many district attorneys have not. You won saying that this was in fact a movement. Do you think that you have been subjected to unfair, overly aggressive criticism or reporting because of who you say you are and what your positions are?
I mean, the short answer is yes. The longer answer is I don't think it's specific to me. I don't think it's personal to me. I think if you look back at the coverage of all kinds of people who were associated with social justice movements in their early days, let's say Gloria Steinem, let's say, I don't know, Kate Millett, if you want to talk about feminism. Let's talk about some of the people who were early on in the 1960s black civil rights movement for, that went many areas, including being enfranchised. I mean, they called MLK, and I in no way compare myself to MLK, but they called him a troublemaker. That is what they did. An outside agitator. That is what the media did. So it's not surprising to me that the media, being one of many institutions and having a very close symbiotic relationship with politics, it's not surprising to me that when people are not centrist, are not traditional, are not doing things the same way, that there's going to be some aggressive journalism. I mean, I don't think that's the end of the world. I don't take it personally. I think then it falls upon people who are somehow, lawyers for this movement, and I'm one of many lawyers for this particular criminal justice reform movement. It falls on us to be more creative and to reach out and to be proactive about getting stories out as opposed to just hearing this very sort of traditional narrative hammer us. But I will say this, I mean, let us not forget what our times are. The first tool of authoritarians is untruth. That is the first tool. And then they go on from there. And, with ChatGPT and AI and social media being an absolute cesspool that is being exploited by authoritarian foreign powers with the help of a former president, when we're in that kind of a situation, it really is important that the media at least be reflective, that just because things are different or just because someone is proposing a different approach, that doesn't automatically invite attacks. It might actually be worthwhile to go a little bit deeper and get a little more contextualized and find out what they're saying. Do I have hard feelings about that? No, not at all.
You know, just let me just say real, because I'm here in Philly. One of the problems that I personally have with most of the attacks on the district attorney have been personal. A lot of them have been personal, and that's just wrong. You can disagree on policy, you can disagree on all those kinds of things, but it shouldn't come down to personal attacks. And he's been subjected to a lot of personal attacks. And I mean, we don't know one another well at all, but that's just wrong. That's just wrong, and it just shouldn't happen.
We got 3 hands here. We're going over the 1:30. How do you feel about that?
We can do one more question, then we'll have to wrap.
Okay, then you decide between these 3.
I'm gonna throw the mic in the middle and then jump. We'll go right here.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Rochelle Aline. I'm a reporter with ABC Action News in Tampa. I want to start with you, Chuck, but if anybody else wants to jump in. Chuck, you talked about getting in front of it, but I often work with police chiefs and sheriffs who don't want to do that. Do you have advice for us as journalists as to how we can hold these leaders accountable when they are reluctant to speak or the relationship is adversarial? They don't want to talk to us or they don't like us.
Well, you have to do your job. You know, you have to do your job. I mean, if you don't speak to a journalist, then don't get angry when they write something or they report something that is inaccurate or not to your liking. If you haven't given them any context, then what do you think they're going to do? They're going to hold the story, right? And you do have to try to be in front of it the best you can. You know, it's like surfing. You got to be in front of the wave or it's going to, overcome you. And sometimes you're in front of a tsunami. And you better be in front of it, okay? And so the best thing is, if you mess up, fess up. And Pershing Park, we screwed up. It was wrong. But you try to get in front of it. Now, there's some folks, obviously, that never forgive you for it. But having said that, you got to do what you got to do. And you got to be able to talk about it and so forth. And sometimes it's very uncomfortable. It's very uneasy. But don't take it as personal. Because you're doing the job, I don't take it as personal, okay? And it's not easy to be attacked. And, believe me, and I got a short fuse, so I don't, but at the same time, you try not to make it personal. And I would talk to those folks in Tampa or wherever. That's just, to me, it's stupid, okay? You got to be out there.
I think that's about it. I want to thank this panel.